Welcome to another episode of Dear Parents. Today, I get to talk about homeschooling. And I don't necessarily talk a lot about homeschooling on a regular basis. We homeschool our family, and I have a lot of parents in my practice that homeschool their kids. And so it's always something interesting when I can talk about homeschooling. One of the things that I didn't realize is how big the homeschooling landscape has become in the past decade. And when I was thinking about this, I went on Substack and I found our guest today, Dixie Dillon Lane, who just wrote this book, Skipping School: A History of American Homeschooling and How It Went Mainstream. And I will be honest with you, this morning I looked on my watch and I knew that I had a interview coming up, and I had to go find this book because my wife swiped it and it was on her nightstand. And I wanted to have Dixie on to talk about the evolution of homeschooling. And I'm giving a really long, rambling introduction, but Dixie has a PhD in history. She homeschools, and she wrote this book that really focuses on the history of homeschooling and how things have evolved, especially in the last several decades. I think as we were starting to talk, one of the things that I think a lot of parents have in their heads is the vision of homeschooling of when they were in school or when they were in high school and what they thought of as homeschooling. And I think there's been lots of updates. So, Dixie, all of that being said, that was a very long introduction. Welcome to the podcast. And I'm really excited to get to chat with you and talk about your new book.
Thank you. I'm really excited to talk with you too.
I would love it if you would kind of tell me about your journey, because from reading your book, it's not something that you've always dreamed of or had the plans to homeschool, which I think is a very common theme in the current homescaping landscape. I don't think most of the homeschoolers out there, parents that are homeschooling their kids, envisioned this when they were children, that they would be homeschooling their children. And maybe that's a more recent thing. So maybe walk us through a little bit about your journey.
Sure. So I grew up in California. Both my parents were teachers. So I knew about homeschooling because of my parents, because we would talk about questions about education and things like that at dinner and when we were just hanging out as a family. We were that kind of nerds. But I went to public school all the way K through 12. And so I was always a little bit curious about homeschooling and interested in it, but I had a pretty good experience in public school. I mean, it was a mixed bag in some ways, but I got a pretty good education. And then went to college and worked for a while and went to graduate school. And I went to graduate school because I was so interested in the history of families,
Mm.
especially, and the history of children and the way that these things have played out over time. And so I just became really interested in the history of education. And one of the things I noticed when I was looking around at different topics for research was that very little was written about this thing called homeschooling.
Sure.
Yeah. And so I started researching it before I was married, before I had children, and then gradually over time got married, started having children. And when our eldest child got to school age, the particular circumstances of our family and our location led us to decide to homeschool. So I found myself in this situation where I was sort of both an outsider and an insider. So
Sure.
I was studying it from an academic point of view or research point of view, and I was also actually doing it. So maybe it's a little bit like someone developing a vaccine secretly testing it on themselves.
Right. You
Yeah.
were like, I've read enough about it that I think I can probably at least get started, or I want to give it a try.
Yes, and like I said, I've been thinking about education since I was a child, and I mean I am a teacher. I mean I'm a teacher in the homeschool now, but I was trained as a professor,
Hmm.
so it's something I enjoy. But that's not really what motivated our family's decision exactly. It was more, and I think as you're saying, this is somewhat common today. It was more based on problem solving. We had a particular child, our particular local public schools, the particular tuitions of our private schools locally. And that just led us to believe that this was the thing we wanted to do. And also, like many homeschoolers, as we got more into it, we discovered many opportunities within it and just some really wonderful things, some really wonderful benefits.
Well, I think that that is not an uncommon way for people to kind of fall into homeschooling, not researching it and writing a book and everything along those lines, but not having it be something that they really were planning on, but then kind of the stars aligned and that's what they felt like was the right move for them. In your book, you talk about kind of the 80s and 90s homeschooling was really kind of countercultural, anti-institutional, fear-based, reactive. And I think that is what some people still have the lingering taste of in their mouth, that that's what homeschooling is. And in the book, you talk about what homeschooling looks like nowadays. So can you kind of compare the experience of homeschooling that most of us probably experienced when we were in high school and saw the homeschooled kids versus what it is nowadays, and not to lump everybody from the 80s and 90s together or say that that was the universal experience, but I think that was the perception of the experience for most people. But can you talk about how things have changed from the 80s and 90s and that version of homeschooling to what it looks like today?
Sure. I think in the second half of the 20th century, up until about 2000, right, the turn of the millennium, I think I think people thought of homeschooling as weird. Now, it's not that the people who did it were weird, and it was always diverse. It's way
Mm-hmm.
more diverse now than it ever was before, but it was always diverse. So in
Mm-hmm.
my book, I'm trying to keep in tension that diversity and trying to find patterns.
Right.
So, but before the turn of the century, yeah, it was just something that was really clearly countercultural. And it was often done for strongly countercultural reasons, whether those were religious reasons or pedagogical reasons or moral reasons or whatever they were. It was often something like you're saying that was done in a sort of, it was a contrary act to
Mm-hmm.
the norm of going to school. And it also was much more legally unsettled at that point than it is now.
Sure.
So when you mention fear, it's not that people were afraid of public schools, although I think some people were, but they were afraid of getting in trouble.
For homeschooling.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
homeschooling, and because of that, there was definitely more of a feeling of fear or needing to keep things under the radar at that time. And I think now, so you talk about, or we were talking just a minute ago about how most people who homeschool today, they didn't necessarily grow up thinking I'm going to homeschool my kids. Some of them did.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are
Mm-hmm.
second generation, but a lot of them didn't. But it would not have occurred to most people in 1985 that they might homeschool.
Right.
And today, people often talk about schooling as more of a choice. Well, we're thinking about this school, we're thinking about that school, we're thinking about homeschooling, and it's even a choice that can change.
Right.
And not everyone has that choice, but for people who do, it's much less automatic in either direction.
I hear it so much more frequently in the exam room today, not with families that homeschool, but they're approaching that school age or they're in the early elementary years. And there isn't this like tie to this is what we're going to do now and forever. It's like this is what's working now, or we're having some issues and we're kind of discussing maybe homeschooling next year. Like I hear that so much more than ever before.
And that's so common. It's so common for families to change approaches year to year or to have one child in school and other
Mm-hmm.
children not, or vice
Mm-hmm.
versa, because homeschooling is you can really tailor it to your particular situation and your particular family members, both the parents and the children. So sometimes it's actually not uncommon for parents to send a really rambunctious 4-year-old to like 3 mornings a week preschool so that they can homeschool the older kids.
Right.
Or
For a
they'll have
little
a
bit
high
of
schooler
a
in, or
little bit of a break or maybe a little
yeah,
bit
or
of
their extrovert
yeah.
is in school and their introverted is at home. And especially when you're talking about the resources involved, because there are financial resources and there's like
Mm-hmm.
emotional and mental energy
Mm-hmm.
resources. Sometimes you're going to prioritize one thing for one child or for one year and another thing for another time or another child.
So do you think that compared to previous generations, that in general, parents are much more flexible, malleable when it comes to the education options for their kids? It seems to me that parents are much more willing or at least curious about kind of zigging and zagging from year to year or from child to child, like you said. Like it's not just our kids all go to this school and then they go to this school and then they go to this school and that's how we do it.
I'm not sure. I think that's a good theory because I've definitely noticed in broader things, there's this idea that there's not a way to be a parent anymore, or a thing that children broadly need, but that
Hmm.
I think people are more attentive to the particular needs of individual children. At the same time, something's changed in how we think about school.
Mm.
Whereas in the first half of the 20th century, and then up until, well, probably up until 2000, right? The whole 20th century, you could say, we really just thought about education as school.
Yeah.
Well, maybe,
What it
1930 and onwards, or so you would, how will my child get an education? I will send him to the public school. Or maybe he's
right,
Catholic. I will send him to the Catholic school. It's not, I'm going
right,
to investigate and choose. But
right. It wasn't
today,
like let's make a
yeah,
table and make a pros and cons list or something along
yeah,
those lines.
yeah.
Now, one of the things that I really like in the book is where how you kind of break it down by the different eras. What changed in the 2000s that really kind of affected things in a major way when it came to the increasing numbers of homeschooling families, the diverse reasons for homeschooling families? Were there any big specific like moments that really led to the institutional change prior to COVID and everything along there?
Yeah, I think COVID was the most revealing one. But before that, in this century, I think one of the interesting things was that as the legality of homeschooling became more clearly settled in each state, sometimes the litigation that occurred and the public response showed that people were already quite accepting of homeschooling
Mm,
by that time. So they may not have wanted to do it themselves, but there was sort of a presumption that it was allowed by the time you get into the 21st century, and that wasn't the case in the 1980s, for
sure.
example.
That makes sense.
And some of that's just because homeschooling was growing. Some of it is because public school performance has continued to deteriorate or has been deteriorating for some time. And I think it's also because as homeschoolers grew in number and as they became more diverse, so more different kinds of people homeschooling,
Sure.
and it was legal, and there's more curricula, it became easier to access resources. I think people just were more public and they were
Sure.
doing things like I mentioned before, that there was sort of a countercultural, or you pointed out, anti-school view of or experience of homeschooling in the 20th century. And in this century, people have been much more willing to draw on resources from institutions and schools. So you
Hmm.
start having public schools that have homeschool programs, for example. And that
For
kind of
sure.
draws the practice into a norm rather than a fringe countercultural activity, even though it's still not something that by any means most Americans are doing.
Right. I definitely see that in our local community too, when it comes to the ways that public schools and parochial schools have different ways that homeschooling families can opt into different things and participate in sports or musicals or things along those lines. And it feels much more closer to like we want to partner side by side with you rather than like there's your area, here's our area.
And I think before the turn of the century, that sort of thing was being done privately.
Hmm.
So, like I mentioned in the book, when I was in the middle school band, the kid who sat next to me was a homeschooler,
Hmm.
but his mom knew the band director, so he could come play.
Right.
And now school districts have policies. So it's much less often that you make a deal with the coach. And it's
Right.
more like my local school district, you can participate in extracurriculars at the high school, but you have to take at least 2 classes.
Sure.
You have to enroll part time. And I think some of it is just really that public schools have lost enrollment. I mean, for
Mm-hmm.
many reasons, the main one of which is the decline in the number of children in the country or birth rates going down in some places. But
Right.
also, like with the pandemic, so many people left school that public schools really jumped to try to accommodate to get some of those kids back.
Right. Because I think if they're coming for a couple of classes, then they might find that that's something that they really like or that they want to add another class. And it's a way to help reach those families and also to bolster their own numbers and ensure that there's still ongoing access and more kids entering the school system.
Right.
With COVID and the pandemic, I mean, obviously everything escalated and there was gasoline thrown on the fire there. What are some of the misconceptions around the pandemic and homeschooling that parents think but don't get quite right?
Hmm. Well, I think I observed something very interesting during COVID, especially the first 2 years regarding homeschooling. I don't know if you did too. Maybe some of your listeners did. But what I observed was that upon the school lockdowns, right? And then in the fall of 2020, when school
Mm-hmm.
resumed, at which point homeschooling numbers had doubled across
Mm-hmm.
that summer, right? So I observed that people were extremely friendly to homeschooling. There were a lot of celebrities who were tweeting out, I don't know how you guys do this. This is the
Right.
hardest thing I've ever done. And, some of them are talking about homeschooling, some of them are talking about supervising Zoom schooling, but they're using the
Right.
word homeschooling because they're
Right.
still sort of, it's still sort of homeschooling, right? They're
Right. Right.
implementing this stuff at home. And it was really hard for everybody. But there were a lot of warm fuzzies. And I remember like homeschooling blogs posting things about like, welcome, let us help you. Here's how you can find curricula. You can do this. And then pretty soon, there started to be backlash in the media.
Mm.
And there were some now very well known articles that came out linking homeschooling with abuse. There have been documentaries. There's been a lot of publication that's alarmist about homeschooling. And so I think we saw at the same time this sort of populist rise in homeschooling and acceptance of
Sure.
it, and this sort of response by the media and by sort of people who have stronger voices online and things like that saying, don't do this. This
Mm-hmm.
is dangerous. This is bad. You need to come back to the schools. So I think depending on which one people heard or
Right.
experienced, you have a very different idea of what the state of homeschooling is in the country and what the norm among homeschoolers is. For example, it's an extremely important question whether homeschoolers are or are not more at risk of child abuse or of educational
Sure.
neglect. But it's not very helpful to just make wild assertions about that. That's something that has to be researched.
And has that been researched much in terms of like what the difference is? I mean, you only hear the news stories about the horrendous things that come to light and are news worthy, interesting for headlines and everything along those lines. But I'm curious, and the answer may be there we don't know, is the rates of abuse, neglect, those sorts of things in homeschooling populations versus those that are in the school system.
There's no appreciable difference from the studies that we do have, and we only have a
Okay.
handful. And of course, it's any abuse statistics are going to be compromised because of lack
Sure.
of reporting.
Sure.
But there's really not any evidence that these children are at any higher risk. Certainly academically, they're performing on average slightly above the public schools. I
Okay.
think, and I think we hear these. I mean, you think about the memoirs that come out that
Right.
talk about child abuse in the context of a family that also homeschools. And
Right.
it's very easy to just elide that into it was the homeschooling that supported and enabled this.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that may also, in fact, be the case in a particular family. A family can use things for that if they wish, I suppose. But in terms of the risk or what is the norm, there does not seem to be any appreciable difference
Okay.
between other children and homeschooled children.
Got it. Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Yeah, I figured that wasn't probably that well studied. Now, when we think about the main motivations We talked about what it was like at the end of the last century. What if we're talking about 2024, 2025, 2026? What are the main motivations at the moment for someone to say, this is the year that I'm going to start homeschooling? Are there any big, broad generalizations that we can say that these are the most of the reasons why parents at this stage or at this time are deciding to homeschool?
Mhm. Well, one thing that may surprise your listeners is that the main reason is not religious.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been data kept on this by a couple of different research institutes, well, three main ones, including the US Census and the federal government's National Center for Education Statistics for a while now. And I think the top reasons are safety is a concern.
Okay.
Safety is a concern, whether that's bullying or school safety from shootings and things like that. Academics are a concern. Moral instruction is a concern.
Okay.
Yeah. And then religious instruction is also a concern, but I think you don't quote me on this. I think it's now the fifth, it's maybe the fifth or sixth reason that's cited most often for homeschooling. So I think really people want to do it for academic reasons. They're dissatisfied with the safety of the school. And there are also positive reasons. A lot of the reasons that are asked about in studies are they're sort of negatively framed. So it's
Right.
like, what is wrong with the school that you don't want to go there?
Right.
But there's also, I mean, I think one of the things that happened in the pandemic when people were on lockdown together is that people actually like to be with their children.
Mm,
People don't want to be away from their children as many hours as they often are. And
sure.
so homeschooling offers this opportunity to spend a lot of time with your kids and really enjoy the learning. So it's challenging too, but that is a reason that people have often cited to me in my research is I want to be with my kids.
Well, I imagine these days it's a lot less isolating than it was in decades past, too, because of social media and Facebook groups and all the different ways that you can find people that are doing the similar thing to you and work through those challenges, whether it's preparing a specific curriculum or whether it's dealing with a child that's having a specific issue with some facet of learning. Like there's more resources and you don't feel as isolated in homeschooling as I'm sure they did before the technology of today.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And since school was the only game in town for several decades there, it was school or nothing.
Right.
Like it was school or you're building this thing from the ground up. It wasn't like there
Right.
were homeschool curricula out there. And now there's so much space in between full-time enrollment in school and
Mm-hmm.
your mom actually writing her own curriculum. There's
Mm-hmm.
so much space in there. So it's really available for experimentation to families that want different things.
What do you think the most common hurdles are for families now that are saying, I'm thinking about it, I'm feeling like this is what our family needs or what my child needs, but these are my main hesitations?
Yeah, I think the first one that's not talked about very often is probably financial.
Mm-hmm.
There are two income families that homeschool, but that's even more challenging than homeschooling with most families have one parent as the primary homeschooling parent, which means that
Sure.
parent is not going to be bringing in a separate income. So financially, it's really not available to everyone. It's interesting. It's still the case, however, that demographically, homeschoolers are very much like the rest of the country
Mm.
in many different art markers, but including economically.
Okay.
So we have people who are below the poverty line who are homeschooling, and we have people who are fabulously wealthy who are homeschooling. But there is a financial sacrifice involved if one parent is not already a full time homemaker. I think people are worried about socialization. They're worried how
Mm.
will my kids get to know other kids? Are
Right.
they going to be geeks? Are they going to be awkward? And then I think people are just sort of a little bit apprehensive about the task at hand,
Yeah.
educating your child,
Right.
and this hugely important task, and how am I going to do it? And what if my kid already doesn't listen to me that well? How's this going to go with our relationship? When am I ever going to get a break? That
Yeah.
kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think those would be the main things that I frequently hear from families too, is along all of those lines of like, how do I do it? How do I do it? How do I do it? But that encompasses like, how do we do it financially? How do we actually like sit down and teach a child that doesn't know how to read? Like that seems like a tall ask. And then all of the like, how do I get my child to respect me as teacher and parent and not lose my mind when it comes to being with my child all of that time and wearing these different hats. So that seems to me to be the main challenges that I hear about.
Mhm.
On the socialization front, can you share any research that you know of in terms of socialization and homeschooling? Because I think that is a big thing that I often hear that parents are worried about when it comes to socializing. And I wonder if there's any literature or studies or anything that sheds light on that.
Socialization is the mic drop people deploy
Mm-hmm.
against homeschooling. Like, it doesn't
Yeah,
matter how well you're doing academically, they have to go to school to be socialized. I think from a historical point of view, schools were not that, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, schools have not been very important in socialization. I mean, they have been in the past century and a half. So, I mean, that's quite a while. But
sure,
like, even outside of school, children were until maybe the 1920s, 1930s, primarily socialized within their family
sure.
and then within their local community. And the shift to the idea that socialization has to happen in school only happens in a segregated peer group of children your own age, that's new.
Right,
So I would say from a historical point of view, school isn't necessary for socialization. So I think that's a mistaken assumption that people can make. In terms of data about homeschoolers, they're actually quite socially engaged in terms of things like visits to the public library. They go to the public library at a higher rate than other school children. They go to plays and concerts at a higher rate than other school children. They go to church at a higher rate than other school children.
right,
So they actually are they're out in the community. So they're part of the public. So in terms of whether homeschool children are going to be able to function in stores and going to the
right.
DMV, that doesn't seem to be a real concern. I think that the harder thing is just socialization into the peer culture that
Mm-hmm.
exists around them. And that's a question of what you think the child really needs. So we're
Sure,
all socialized into a particular group. Some parents do not want their children socialized into a peer culture that has a lot of negative sides to it.
right.
I do think that homeschoolers have to be deliberate about making sure their children spend time with other children, but
Mm-hmm.
that's pretty easy these days because
Sure.
homeschooling's so public and there's lots of co-ops and stuff, but you do have to be deliberate. But I will just say anecdotally, like, there are weird people in all walks of life and people who don't know how to behave. So what are we comparing it to also?
Right,
How well socialized are public school children? Are they able to go to a professor at college and politely ask him a question?
right.
Can they do that? So
Yeah,
some can and some can't.
I think a couple of things that you touched on there that I really have seen too is that you do have to be deliberate about it. And so that word really struck me that yes, if you're sending your child to public school, parochial school, they will be around peers that are their age. That doesn't mean they're going to develop good friendships, and they might pick up lots of bad habits or associations or things that you would rather them not, but they will be around a bunch of kids their age. And so to be deliberate about socialization requires that we think through like, well, what are our values? What is important to us? Who do we want our children to be around? What points of view would we like to make sure that they have an understanding of? And that varies widely, as you can imagine. But I think that is something that you do have to deliberately work at. Whereas if they're going to school, that it kind of just passively happens that they're going to be sitting with a bunch of other kids their age and become friends or interact with them in all sorts of different ways. So I think that there is something that to that. And I also would agree completely that I don't think that going to school ensures that you will be well socialized, and not even sure what well socialized means, but some of the thinking through like, well, What do they do when their employer speaks poorly to them? What do they do when they need to go to the bank? Like all the different things that you're just daily life that you don't necessarily get in any school in particular better than any other. And then I also think that there is a lot of socialization that can happen in that family unit. And that when we see children that are having difficulty with socializing, whether they're homeschooled, whether they're in public school, whether they're in parochial school, private school, or whatever, that a lot of the socialization tendencies and practices come from the family rather than from outside the family. So I think the modeling that we do of socialization, the way that we talk to each other, the way that we model respect and dignity and all those different things really have a profound effect on our children, regardless of where they learn at.
I would agree. I was about to say, I think parents are doing this anyway, or parents ought to
Hmm.
be doing this anyway, whether they're school parents or not. Plenty of wonderful school parents are making sure that their kid goes to the bank with them and they learn how to go up to the teller and they
Right.
remember their own bank number and things like that. Or this is how they take them with them to see a sick relative. This is how we visit
Sure.
someone who's sick. So that's really some of the things like that. I think in homeschooling, there's more opportunity for it.
Hmm.
So something like free range parenting or free range opportunities for children to develop childhood independence. It's funny because I think people think of going to school as something that's very independent on the part of the child. And it's true that the child has to self regulate at school in a lot of ways. But homeschooling also provides a lot of opportunity for children to learn these skills of taking on independent projects, learning how to interact with their community and things like that, just because there's time. There's a lot of
Hmm. There is more time for all of that and to get into more of the weeds and practice and all of those sorts of things. I wanted to end with a question on ramping kids that are homeschooled to the real world and ways that we can help our children that are homeschooled to be in the world, but not necessarily of the world. What does that look like when it comes to kind of providing for that on ramp for kids when they're experiencing those educational years outside of the traditional institutional school landscape?
So do you mean like preparing for adult life or preparing for
Preparing for
college?
adult life. Yeah.
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 I think a lot of this is relational
Hmm.
because as we were talking about earlier, if you're homeschooling and say you're the mom and you're a homemaker and you're going to homeschool the children and that's going to be one of your primary work, some of your primary work. You have to do a lot of decision making. There's discipline involved. There's a lot of emotional care involved. There's a lot of observation of the children. There's a lot of answering math questions. It's a very big job. And then, just as with every other part of parenting, you have to figure out when you need to step back and allow the child
Mm.
to spread his wings a little bit. And I think that's something in homeschooling that often happens as children enter middle school and high school and they start to take more responsibility for their own study. So that's one thing that happens. And I think one thing that I've noticed in the years that I've taught college on occasion is that homeschoolers like other kids come in prepared and not prepared in a lot of different ways. And
Hmm.
it like you were saying, it seems to have a lot more to do with the family than it does with the particular way what kind of school they've gone to at least.
Sure.
And so again, I think it's just deliberate. It's trying to think through some of the things. I don't know if you've had this experience, but you know how sometimes your kid does something and it's just wildly ridiculous. And you think to yourself, he has no common sense. And suddenly you realize that that particular thing is not common sense. It is learned. You learned
Mm.
it at some point when you were a child, and your child has not
Hmm.
learned it yet. And I
Totally.
think maybe homeschool parents have to be a little more aware of that because your kid is not bumping into a teacher every day
Right.
or into peers who are going to rub those rough edges off. And
Hmm.
so maybe just being a little bit deliberate about those tasks of adulthood and those attitudes of adulthood. But as I was saying before, homeschooling gives a lot of opportunity for that too, to support or scaffold your child as they start to take on adult responsibilities as they get older.
I think that's been important for us too, is the scaffolding, helping them to develop the skills that then they can take those skills and apply them to other scenarios. I'm thinking of our daughter who just got her first job and she had to get a bank account and then she had to deposit her check. These are all things that I could have done for her, but I gave her a little bit of scaffolding of like, okay, you go to the bank, here's what you're going to say. She went and did it. She got her bank account opened. She got all these different things, but that does take practice, but it's kind of irrespective of where they're getting schooled at, that to help them to be socialized, to know the proper forms of communication and the ways to interact with peers and employers and all those sorts of things, that just takes practice. And most of that practice is actually going to happen in the home setting, regardless of the type of school that they go to. And as you said, with homeschooling, you just have a lot more time and opportunities for those things. Well, this has been a really interesting discussion. Your book is great. I brought it into the office today. I was telling you before we started recording, and my office manager, who was homeschooled, grabbed it from me and was reading through it as well and learning a lot because she was homeschooled in the 90s and the 2000s. If you are a parent that is interested in learning about the history of homeschooling, if you are a homeschooling parent that wants to know more about homeschoolers, if you're just curious about the educational landscape and how things have changed, I would highly recommend you pick up Dixie's book, Skipping School, A History of American Homeschooling and How It Went Mainstream. The last thing that I will say that I learned, it's right at the end of the book, is that I did not realize that there were more homeschooled kids than there are kids going to parochial schools. That was a
Why?
shocking statistic to me, and I don't think that most people would realize that there are that many homeschooling kids compared to those that are in parochial schools.
Yeah, that's just wild because when we think of like parochial schools, it's not something everybody does, but it's not weird. It's
Right,
normal. Right? You say
right.
you go to Catholic school, people are like, oh, yeah. Well, you know what? Now you say I'm homeschooled, and people say, oh, yeah, my sister
Yeah,
does that. So
it's
it's a
very
new world.
mainstream. So, well, thank you so much. This has been such a great discussion. I will put the links to your Substack and where to pick up your book in the show notes, and I would encourage everyone to read, learn, and keep up the good work.